Okay, picture this. You're on the digital front lines, yeah. And alerts are just screaming in from every direction. It feels a bit like an emergency room, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Multiple critical situations, all demanding attention right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you've got limited time, limited resources. The stakes couldn't be higher. So how do you, the defender, actually decide what needs tackling first?
That's the core challenge.
Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to really cut through that relentless noise, especially in critical cybersecurity operations. We've got an amazing stack of sources you sent over, covering efficient alert triage, some really advanced analytical techniques, and that crucial operational security piece.
Hmm.
We're going to unpack all of this, pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights, basically give you a shortcut to being really well informed on this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. We'll look at how the top security operations centers, the SOCs, manage to prioritize threats effectively.
Yeah.
We'll also get into the psychology of it, those hidden biases that can trip up even really good analysts.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And importantly, how not to tip off the bad guys while you're investigating.
Right. And we'll also break down email attacks, how email actually works under the hood, the clever ways attackers misuse it, and really hammer home why that foundational knowledge is so vital, especially when the threats change constantly.
Couldn't agree more. Where should we start?
Well, let's dive right into triage. From what we've seen in the material, it's crystal clear. Alert triage is like one of the most critical jobs an analyst has. It really brings home that ER analogy, right?
Hmm.
You've got to ask yourself, okay, based on this data right now, which situation looks like the biggest fire?
And what's really interesting there is how much it underlines the resource constraints.
Yeah.
You physically cannot chase down every single alert. It's impossible.
So prioritization isn't just about urgent.
No, not at all. It's a calculation. You have to weigh the potential impact, how bad could this get, against the effort it's going to take to actually investigate and fix it.
Yeah. So if you're that analyst staring at the screen, how do you actually define dangerous in that moment? The sources gave us some pretty clear criteria.
Yeah, they did. You're looking for attacks that are getting close to the finish line, think data exfiltration starting, or signs of imminent destruction.
Yeah.
That's priority one.
Okay.
Then anything targeting your high-value assets. That could be critical servers, key business processes, sensitive data stores, maybe high-privileged user accounts like domain admins.
That's tense.
Also, you bump things up the list if you suspect it's a truly advanced or targeted attacker, not just opportunistic noise. And finally, those really weird, unique alerts, the ones you've maybe never seen before.
Right.
Ultimately, it boils down to anything that's likely to cause major damage, cost a lot of money, or be incredibly painful to clean up if it succeeds.
Okay, so knowing what makes an alert dangerous is one thing, but spotting those critical attacks in progress before it's too late, that sounds tough. How do the sources say we actually spot those signs?
Okay, so for data exfiltration, you might see things like high-volume DNS tunneling. That's basically attackers sneaking data out using the DNS system itself.
Clever. Sneaky.
Very. Or just unusual high-volume traffic going to weird destinations. Maybe the use of strange compressed files with passwords, think 7-zip or WinRR, being run from the command line, not the GUI.
Okay.
Also, lots of outbound firewall denials from one specific machine could be a sign. Alerts from your DLP, data loss prevention, or UEBA systems. User and entity behavior analytics. Those are designed specifically for this.
Right, those are key tools.
And even URLs with really long, weird parameters.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's base 64 encoded data being snuck out.
Wow. Okay, and what about the other side of that coin, data destruction? What are the telltale signs there?
For destruction, you're thinking about things like your patching servers getting compromised or high-privilege accounts being taken over, unexplained changes to GPOs, group policy objects. Those are super powerful.
Definitely. Changes there can wreck things fast.
Absolutely. Or seeing secure deletion tools being used, things like delete on Windows or shred wipes from on Linux. These aren't just delete, they overwrite data to make it unrecoverable.
That's a clear sign of malicious intent.
Huge red flag. And of course, if you see known wiper malware families like Destover or Shamoon, well, that's about as bad as it gets. Immediate priority.
So the sources talk about using mental models like the cyber kill chain or the cyber attack lifecycle to kind of estimate how far along the attacker is. How do those help?
They give you a shared language, a framework. Everyone understands the stages: reconnaissance, weaponization, delivery, exploitation, installation, C2, actions on objectives. The kill chain is great for visualizing those distinct chases.
Right.
But the cyber attack lifecycle model, maybe,
Yeah.
better captures the reality that attacks often aren't linear. Attackers loop back, they escalate privileges, move laterally, then maybe escalate again.
Yeah.
It's more iterative.
So it's not always step 1, step 2, step 3.
Exactly. It could be more like step 4, then back to 3, then jump to 5, then laterally to another 5. These models help you map that out.
Gotcha. But what if you've got, say, multiple alerts all at the same stage, maybe several different exploit attempts hitting different systems? How do you choose them?
Yeah, that's a really important question. You need to dig deeper.
Yeah.
Ask, what does the exploit actually do? Is it aiming for admin rights, like Eternal Blue, or just user access?
Okay.
Did it actually work? Is there evidence it succeeded? What kind of system is being targeted? Is it a critical internal server or just a regular employee's laptop?
Location matters too, right?
Huge difference. Is it on the network perimeter or is it deep inside a sensitive subnet? And who's the user being attacked? An admin account getting hit is way more critical than a standard user.
So like the zero logon example.
Perfect example. A zero login attempt against a domain controller. That strongly implies the attacker is already inside your network.
Yeah.
That jumps straight to the top of the pile.
That brings us to this really interesting idea the sources mentioned, least frequency of occurrence or long tail analysis. What's that all about?
It's a powerful concept. Basically, it means that the alerts you see least often, the ones with really low counts, those are often the most interesting ones.
Why is that?
Well, think about it. If you have an advanced attacker, an APT, doing something genuinely new or customized inside your network, it might only trigger a specific alert signature once, maybe twice.
Ah, okay. It stands out because it's rare.
Exactly. Common alerts, port scans, failed logins, they generate tons of noise. This technique helps you filter that out and surface the unique, potentially ongoing attacks that might otherwise just get lost. Finding the needle in the haystack.
So flipping that around, what kind of alerts can we generally feel safer about putting lower down the priority list, at least initially?
Generally, yeah, things that happen constantly or are often just noise or accidents.
Yeah.
External port scanning from the internet, that's mostly just background radiation.
Right, internet weather.
Pretty much. Single instances of minor policy violations, maybe 1 or 2 failed login attempts from a user who just forgot their password, or those low confidence matches to generic malicious IP lists, they often take a ton of digging for very little payoff. You can usually circle back to those later if needed.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. You might think intuitively that having more data is always better for analysis. But the sources, especially referencing Richard Hoyer Jr.'s work on intelligence analysis, they say something kind of surprising.
Yeah, Hoyer's work, based on his 45 years at the CIA, is really insightful here. He argued that pretty much all real-world analysis problems involve high uncertainty and involve the human brain. It's actually not great at dealing with that uncertainty objectively.
Right.
We're prone to all sorts of unconscious biases, and Hoyer was adamant. Just knowing about the biases isn't enough to overcome them. You need structured techniques, tools to force yourself to think differently.
It's kind of humbling, isn't it? The idea that our own perception can actively mislead us. And once we form a mindset, a possible explanation, it's incredibly hard to shake.
Oh, definitely. Mindsets form fast, and they are sticky. Once you think you've found an explanation, it's really hard to see alternatives, even if new evidence comes in.
So new information arriving bit by bit might not change your mind.
Exactly. You might miss the big picture, because each small piece gets interpreted through your existing lens. The classic optical illusion, my wife and my mother-in-law, is a perfect, simple example. Even when you know there are 2 ways to see the picture, switching perspective is hard. We tend to see what we expect to see.
So how does this play out for a security analyst day to day? The sources point out a really common but problematic way people approach alerts.
Yeah, the typical intuitive approach goes something like this. An analyst gets an alert, they form a quick hypothesis, okay, this looks like malware trying to call home, and then they start looking for evidence to confirm that hypothesis.
That's confirmation bias, right?
Textbook confirmation bias. The mystery sequence generator experiment one source described illustrates it perfectly. People naturally try to prove their theory right instead of trying to disprove it. But think about it. No amount of confirming evidence can ever truly prove a hypothesis is 100% correct. But just one solid piece of disconfirming evidence can rule it out completely.
That's a really key distinction. Focus on breaking your theory, not just building it up.
Exactly.
Okay, and if battling cognitive biases wasn't hard enough, there's the limitation of our short-term memory. Like 7 things at once, max. Cybersecurity incidents involve way more pieces than that. How do we possibly keep it all straight?
Yeah, the 7 ± 2 rule. It's a real bottleneck. Hoyer's solution. He called it decomposition and externalization.
Break it down and write it down.
Pretty much. Break the complex problem into smaller, manageable chunks that you can wrap your head around, and then critically get it out of your head. Write it down, draw diagrams, use tools.
It's like link analysis tools.
Perfect examples. Tools like Maltego or YED for visualizing connections between IPs, domains, malware samples, or even simple event matrices to track actions chronologically across different hosts or accounts. It frees up your mental bandwidth for the actual thinking part.
The sources also bring in Daniel Kahneman's concept of System 1 and System 2 thinking, fast versus slow.
Right. System 1 is that fast, intuitive, almost automatic gut reaction. System 2 is the slow, deliberate, effortful analysis. For complex, high-stakes security incidents, you absolutely want to engage System 2.
And structured analytical techniques are the way to do that.
Precisely. They act as a forcing function, a deliberate check on those quick, potentially biased System 1 judgments. They help ensure you're being thorough and objective.
So given how easy it is to fall into confirmation bias, what's a really practical, structured technique the sources recommend to fight it head-on? They talk a lot about analysis of competing hypotheses, or ACH.
ACH is fantastic for this. It's directly inspired by Karl Popper's idea of scientific progress through empirical falsification, trying to prove things wrong.
Okay, how does it work in practice?
You start by identifying several plausible but mutually exclusive hypotheses about what's happening, meaning only one of them can actually be true.
Like, is this ransomware, a data thief, or an insider threat?
Exactly. Then you create a matrix. List your hypotheses across the top and list all the relevant pieces of evidence down the side. Then you systematically evaluate every piece of evidence against each hypothesis. Does this evidence support it, refute it, or is it irrelevant?
So you're not trying to prove one right.
No. The goal is to try and disprove the hypotheses. You're looking for the evidence that most strongly argues against each possibility. The hypothesis that survives this rigorous attempt at falsification, the one with the fewest inconsistencies, is likely the most accurate one.
And it leaves a record too, right?
That's another huge benefit. It creates an audit trail of your reasoning. Anyone can look at your ACH matrix and see why you reached your conclusion. You focus on the evidence that really shifts the relative likelihood of the hypotheses.
Okay, so we've tackled the external threats, our own internal biases. But what about protecting ourselves while we investigate? We can't accidentally tip off the attacker that we're on to them. This gets us into operational security, or OPSCC, for defenders. What's the main goal here?
The main goal is simple. Deny the adversary useful information. We want to hide what we know about their activities, what our capabilities are for detecting and responding, and what our intentions are. Are we watching? Are we about to block them, etc.?
And this is mostly for targeted attacks.
Primarily, yes. If it's a sophisticated attacker who has specifically targeted your organization and they realize they've been detected, they might change their tools, their infrastructure, activate hidden backdoors, or just speed up their attack to grab what they want before they get kicked out. Good OPSCC makes their life harder and ours easier.
The sources mention specific protocols for sharing threat intelligence safely, like TLP and PP. Can you break those down?
Sure. TLP is the traffic light protocol. It's basically a color coding system for classifying information based on how widely it can be shared. TLP white is public, green is shareable within a community, amber is limited sharing within an organization, and red is eyes only for specific recipients.
Okay, that dictates sharing scope. What about PAP?
PAP, Permissible Actions Protocol, is different. It tells you what you're allowed to do with the information. PAC green means you can take active measures based on it. Other levels restrict you, maybe down to PAP red, which usually means you can only use it for passive analysis, nothing that the attacker might detect.
So they work together.
Exactly. You might get an indicator marked TLP.amber PAPA red red. That means you can share it within your org, but you absolutely cannot take any active blocking or scanning actions based on it, because that could tip off the source or the attacker.
Got it. And the sources emphasize passive searching when using open source intelligence, or OSINT tools. Why is that so important for OPSEC?
Because passive searching means you're retrieving information that someone else has already collected and stored without making any new connections or requests to the actual attacker infrastructure.
Like checking VirusTotal or RiskIQ for an IP address.
Exactly. Ideally, those tools have already scanned it or gathered info, and you're just pulling from their cache. But, and this is a big but, you have to know your tools.
What do you mean?
Some OSINT sites, even if they have cached data, might perform a fresh scan when you query them. Or they might log that someone queried a specific indicator. or if you submit a file to a public sandbox.
The attacker could potentially see that submission or even download the file.
Precisely. Especially if the file itself contains unique identifiers or even sensitive company data. Submitting malware to a public sandbox essentially makes it public. If the attacker monitors that sandbox, they know you've found their sample. It's a potential OPSC disaster.
So what are some of the most common ways defenders accidentally screw up their OPSC and elude the attackers? The sources listed a few critical ones.
Yeah, there are definitely common pitfalls. One big one is public IOC submission. Taking a unique URL, a specific domain, an IP address only used in this attack, or a unique malware hash, and plugging it into VirusTotal or another public tool. It can act like a flare gun. It tells the attacker, hey, someone found my stuff.
Okay, what else?
Directly interacting with attacker infrastructure. Things like running a DNS lookup from your corporate network against their command and control domain, or port scanning their IP address, or even just downloading the malware sample using your company's internet connection with a standard browser user agent. All of that can show up in the attacker's logs.
So they see your company's IP address, probing them.
Exactly. Big red flag for them. It's much safer to use passive sources, or if you absolutely must interact, do it from an anonymized connection, maybe simulate expected victim traffic patterns.
And the third one, the premature block.
Right, the premature block. Especially with advanced targeted attackers. If you just suddenly block their C2 communication or firewall off the infected machine, they'll know they've been burned.
And they might switch tactics.
Yep. They might activate dormant secondary backdoors you don't know about, change their communication methods, or try to destroy evidence. Sometimes a more cautious watch-and-wait strategy, where you carefully monitor their actions without revealing your hand immediately, lets you gather more intelligence and plan a more comprehensive eviction.
That watch and wait feels risky, though. What if they do more damage while you're watching?
It is a calculated risk, absolutely. It's not always the right answer. You have to weigh the potential for intelligence gain against the potential for further damage. It requires strong containment capabilities and clear rules of engagement for when you do pull the trigger. But acting too soon can sometimes mean you only cut off one head of the hydra.
Makes sense. So specifically for investigating phishing emails, a very common scenario.
Yeah.
How do you do that without triggering those tracking pixels or unique links the attackers use?
Good question. First rule. Never load external images automatically in your email client when looking at a suspicious email. Those images, even tiny pixels, are often the tracking mechanism.
Okay, disable image loading. What else?
Second, if you're looking at a suspicious link, always examine the URL carefully first. Remove any parameters that look like unique identifiers or email addresses before you even think about visiting it.
Sanitize the URL.
Exactly. And always visit that link from an anonymous IP address, use a VPN, Tor, or ideally a dedicated analysis VM like Remnux that's completely separate from your corporate network. Never click it directly from your work machine.
And definitely don't upload the whole email.
Absolutely not. Never submit the full email, especially with headers that show recipient names or internal routing to a public sandbox.
Yeah.
That's just handing potentially sensitive internal info over. Analyze attachments and links separately and anonymously.
That focus on OPSC, especially for targeted stuff, is crucial. But let's zoom out to email in general. It's such a ubiquitous attack vector. How does understanding the plumbing of email actually help defenders? The sources really went deep on how email travels.
Yeah, understanding the journey is key. There are three main parts. The MUA, mail user agent, that's your Outlook, Gmail, whatever client you use. Then the MTAs, message transfer agents, these are the servers that relay the email across the internet. And finally, the MDA, message delivery agent, where the email gets stored, like your inbox server.
And those received headers track the path.
Right. Each MTA that handles the email adds a received header, usually the top. So you read them from bottom to top to trace the path back. But, and this is critical, you can only really trust the received headers added by your own internal mail servers.
Why is that?
Because anything before it hits your controlled environment could have been completely faked by the attacker. They can forge those earlier headers. So trace it back until you hit a server you manage, and only trust the headers from that point inward.
Gotcha. Now, SMTP, the basic email protocol from way back in '82,
Yeah.
it didn't have authentication. Anyone could just type mail from president@whitehouse.gov, basically. How did we fix that massive hole?
Well, fix is a strong word, but we have layers now. The big three are SPF, DKIM, and DMARC.
Okay, break those down. SPF.
SPF, Sender Policy Framework. It lets a domain owner publish a DNS record saying, these are the only IP addresses allowed to send email as my domain. The receiving server checks the connecting IP against that list. It looks at the mail from or return path address, which isn't always the same as the visible from address.
Okay. DKIM.
DKIM, domain keys identified mail. This uses digital signatures. The sending server signs parts of the email headers and body. The receiving server uses the public key in the sender's DNS record to verify that signature. It proves the email hasn't been tampered with and actually came from a server authorized by that domain.
And DMRC ties them together.
Exactly. DMRC, Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Compliance. It builds on SPF and DKIM. Critically, it checks if the domain in the visible from address, the one the user sees, aligns with the domain validated by SPF or DKIM. It also tells the receiver what to do if checks fail, reject the email, quarantine it, or just report it.
So DMRC links the technical checks to the address the user actually sees.
That's the key alignment piece. Then you have things like ARC, Authenticated Received Chain, which helps preserve authentication results when emails go through legitimate forwarders, like mailing lists, which can sometimes break DKIM or SPF.
And what about BIMI? That's newer, right?
Yeah, BIMI brand indicators for message identification. This lets legitimate brands display their official logo right next to the from address in participating email clients. But to use BIMI, you need strict DRC enforcement, reject or quarantine, and a special verified mark certificate proving you own the logo trademark. It makes phishing impersonation harder.
So with all these checks, SPF, DKIM, DRMRs, how can an analyst quickly see the results for a specific email?
The easiest way is to look for the authentication results header in the raw email source. It's usually a single line that summarizes the pass, fail, or neutral status for each check: SPF, DKIM, DMARC, sometimes ARC.
Like a quick report card.
Exactly. And often, especially in enterprise environments like Microsoft 365, you'll see other headers like X4Front Anti-Spam Report that give even more detail, like the Spam Confidence Level, SCL, or why something might have been flagged even if DMARCs passed, maybe due to content filtering.
Okay, so we understand the plumbing and the checks. What are the most common ways attackers actually use email to attack us, according to the sources?
Well, the classics are still prevalent. Directly attach malicious files, executables hidden as zips, Office docs with macros, maybe password-protected archives to try and evade scanning.
Still works surprisingly often.
Sadly, yes. Then malicious links are huge links to phishing pages, maybe hosted on compromised legitimate websites, or using file sharing services, URL shorteners, or open redirects to hide the real destination.
Open redirect.
Yeah, where you use a legitimate website's redirection feature to bounce the user to a malicious site. Looks legit at first glance.
Tricky. What else?
Business email compromise, or BAS. That's the social engineering stuff, often with no malware or links at all, just trying to trick someone into wiring money or giving up credentials. And, less common now, but still possible, exploits targeting the mail client itself, or the OS, like that old Windows TIFF vulnerability.
And spoofed emails.
If an email is clearly spoofed, meaning the from address is forged, and it fails authentication checks like DNRs, it's almost always a sign of something malicious. Legitimate senders generally don't fail those checks anymore.
So what can defenders actually do about these common methods? How do we stop them?
For attachments, you need multiple layers, block known bad file extensions at the gateway, use dynamic analysis sandboxing to safely detonate unknown files and see what they do, quarantine anything suspicious.
And on the endpoint?
On Windows endpoints, things like attack surface reduction, ASR rules are powerful. They can block Office apps from creating executable content or running scripts. Application Guard for Office can open attachments in an isolated container.
Okay, what about the links?
For malicious links, awareness is key. Understand that even legitimate-looking domains might be compromised. Know how link shorteners and open redirects work to mask the final destination. Train users to hover over links, and always be suspicious of look-alike domains, like payp1.com instead of paypal.com. URL filtering at the gateway and endpoint helps too.
BEC attacks, the CEO fraud type.
Yeah.
Those are tough because there's often nothing technically malicious to block. It's all psychological manipulation.
Exactly. Detection there often relies on spotting anomalies after an account might be compromised, or looking for behavioral clues. Things like suspicious inbox rules being created, auto-forwarding all email externally, or auto-deleting emails with keywords like invoice or payment.
The attacker trying to hide their tracks or intercept messages.
Right. Or finding new, unexpected mailbox delegates set up, or looking for anomalous logins, someone logging into a US-based user's account from a Nigerian IP address via VPN, for instance. MFA helps a lot against credential theft, but it's not foolproof against everything, like consent grant attacks. User training is absolutely paramount for BEC.
That's a really good point about consent grant attacks bypassing some MFA. Now, what about investigating credential phishing? The sources mentioned being able to see what the user actually typed. How does that work?
Yeah, that's incredibly useful for incident response.
Yeah.
If a user clicks a phishing link designed to steal credentials and actually enters their username and password, sometimes you can recover what they typed.
How?
If you have detailed web proxy logs that capture POST request bodies, or if you were lucky enough to get a full packet capture, PCAP, of the traffic between the user and the phishing site, the submitted credentials might be visible right there in the HTTP POST data.
Wow, so you can immediately know which password was compromised.
Exactly. It allows for much faster credential reset and assessment of what else the attacker might have accessed if they successfully logged in elsewhere with those credentials.
Okay, so pulling it all together for email, the sources keep coming back to this core question. Is this attack targeted or just opportunistic spray and pray?
Yes, that question should always be in the back of your mind during an investigation. Look for any signs of customization. Did they use the company logo? Mention internal project names or specific colleagues? Is the recipient list very specific? Are the indicators of compromise, IPs, domains, hashes, unique to this incident, or are they seen widely in other generic campaigns?
And why does that distinction matter so much?
Because it completely changes your response posture. A generic, widespread attack, you can probably handle it with standard, maybe even automated procedures. Block the IOCs, clean the machines, move on. But a targeted attack implies a more sophisticated adversary, specifically after your organization. That's when careful OPSE, potential wash and wait, and a much more deliberate, intelligence-driven response become critical. You need to assume they might have other footholds or will adapt if detected clumsily.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so zooming out again, we've covered triage, psychology, OPSC, email. What about the overall health and improvement of the Security Operations Center itself? SOCs are under huge pressure to work fast, but the sources stressed balancing speed with quality.
Absolutely. Speed is relatively easy to measure: time to close ticket, time to detect. Quality is harder, but arguably more important in the long run.
So how do you measure or ensure quality?
Good documentation is key. Having detailed notes on what was investigated, what was found, what actions were taken. Also, analytical completeness. Even if you only detected an attack at the C2 stage, did you try to reconstruct the earlier stages? How did they get in? Where else might they be? And then, properly classifying closed incidents to feed metrics and improve detection rules. Your own historical incident data is often your most valuable source of threat intelligence.
And the sources mention specific techniques to challenge analysis within the team to avoid groupthink.
Yeah, these challenge analysis techniques are great for ensuring rigor. Things like pre-mortem analysis. Before you kick off a big response plan, you brainstorm all the ways it could possibly fail. What assumptions are we making? What could go wrong?
Sort of like predicting the failure points.
Exactly. Then there's structured self-critique, where you deliberately play devil's advocate against your own analysis. What are the weakest points in my argument? What evidence contradicts my hypothesis? And what if? Analysis, exploring low probability but high impact scenarios. What if this seemingly minor alert is actually the tip of a major iceberg? It forces you to consider alternatives.
These sound like ways to bake in that critical system 2 thinking.
That's precisely what they do. They counteract complacency and overconfidence.
Finally, the sources spend a lot of time on various mental models, frameworks for thinking about attacks, defense, intelligence. Why are these abstract concepts so important?
Because the cyber world is incredibly complex, mental models provide simplified, structured ways to understand that complexity, organize information, make sense of ambiguous data, and choose effective actions. They're like cognitive shortcuts or lenses.
Can you give us a quick rundown of some of the key ones highlighted?
Sure, encapsulation was one. Thinking in layers. Network traffic has layers: OSI model, layer 7 attacks. Files can be nested. A zip in an email contains a Word doc, which contains a macro, which drops an executable. You have to unpack all the layers, get to the bottom to find the real threat.
Okay, that makes sense. Peel the onion.
Right. The Alexia principle is a great starting point for any investigation. What question am I trying to answer? What data do I need to answer it? How do I get that data? What does the data actually tell me? It provides immediate focus.
And the OD loop. Observe, orient, decide, act.
Classic military strategy, highly applicable here. The side that can cycle through, observing the situation, orienting themselves, understanding what it means, deciding on a course of action and acting on it faster than the opponent, gains the advantage. That orient step. That's where having good mental models is critical for quick, accurate understanding.
What else? Kill chain.
Yeah. The cyber kill chain and campaign analysis help understand intrusion stages and link-related attacks. Defense in depth is a fundamental model for building layered security. The incident response cycle often plays a role. Preparation, identification, containment, eradication, recovery, lessons learned provides a framework for handling incidents end-to-end.
And for threat intel.
You've got levels of threat intelligence, strategic, operational, tactical, showing who needs what kind of info. Cycles like F3EAD, find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, disseminate, or the diamond model explain the intel process itself.
The sources also mentioned attack trees and thinking in graphs.
Hugely important. Attack trees map out all the potential paths an attacker could take to reach a specific goal, and the quote associated with it is powerful. Defenders think in lists, attackers think in graphs. As long as this is true, attackers win. It pushes defenders to think about interconnected paths and anticipate attacker movement, not just block individual items on a checklist.
And the pyramid of pain, that one seems really foundational for defenders.
Absolutely. It ranks different types of indicators based on how much pain it causes an attacker if you deny them that indicator. Hashes are easy to change, low pain. IP addresses, domains are a bit harder. Network or host artifacts, tools, harder still. But denying their core tactics, techniques, and procedures, TDPs, that forces them to fundamentally change how they operate. That's high pain and where defenders should aim to focus their efforts.
And finally, IRE, ATT and TK.
ATT and TK is essentially the encyclopedia of TTPs, a massive community-driven knowledge base categorizing real-world adversary behaviors. It's become the standard language for describing attacker actions and mapping defenses. It's that blue team checklist on steroids.
So bringing it all together, these models aren't rigid rules, are they? The sources said all models are wrong, some are useful.
Precisely the right takeaway. They are simplifications of reality. But they are incredibly useful simplifications. They help us make sense of the chaos, communicate effectively, choose better defensive strategies, and ultimately iterate and improve faster than the adversary. That's how you gain the advantage.
Wow. We have covered a ton of ground today. A true deep dive into cybersecurity operations, from that gut-wrenching urgency of alert triage through the psychology of analysis, the shadows of OPSE, the nuts and bolts of email attacks, right up to these powerful mental models.
Yeah, it's a complex field, but breaking it down helps.
Absolutely. And hopefully you listening now feel equipped not just with facts, but with these structured approaches, these ways of thinking that can really transform how you interpret information and make decisions, frankly, in any high-stakes situation, not just cyber.
That's the goal.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. We talked a lot about biases, perception, the need to challenge assumptions. The cyber landscape is always shifting, always evolving. So consider this. What deeply ingrained assumption might you be holding on to right now about threats, about defenses, about how things work that, if you consciously challenged it, could unlock your next big aha moment in staying ahead of whatever tomorrow brings?
That's a great question to ponder. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. We'll be here for your next deep dive.